Hey guys, first Regardsman here, and today I'll be talking about Space Marine 2 again. This game has gone through a lot of changes since its original launch in 2024. We've had brand new weapons, game modes, and even a new class added, and all of this can seem a bit daunting to a new player. So in this video, we're going to cover the most important things you need to know when starting out in Space Marine 2 to make the leveling grind and overall experience go more smoothly, whether you are a new or returning player. I will primarily be covering the Operations PvE game mode in this video, since that is where 90% of Space Marine 2's content is actually focused. But before we dive directly into that, I want to make mention of the other two major modes, which are the campaign and PvP. Space Marine 2's campaign is a great experience, and where I would suggest most players start if they really want to experience everything the game has to offer, as it is a really good learning experience and is far less complicated than Operations. Though I do want to mention that while the campaign is really fun with cool set pieces, it has not received practically any post-launch content beyond some balancing changes, so it can wind up feeling very bare bones if you play it after you've already put time to the Operations mode, as Operations has had the most content added to it post-launch. The PvP mode, Eternal War, has received more updates in the campaign, but still remains a fairly niche mode with the standard assortment of PvP modes on top of the more recently added Hellbrute Onslaught, which lets you actually play as a Hellbrute. This is also the only mode that you can play as a Heretic Astartes, so if that interests you and you enjoy PvP, definitely give it a shot. Now, the majority of content in Space Marine 2 is in the Operations mode, and when you load into Operations, you'll first be placed into the Battle Barge just like other modes, and you'll have access to your Mission Terminal, Armory Hall, and Data Vault. The Armory Hall is where you will select your loadout, customize your Space Marines chapter, and purchase perks for your class and weapons. Now, doing this will require you to spend multiple types of in-game currency. Currently, there are 3 types of currency in Space Marine 2, with Armory data that we'll get more into during the weapon upgrading section, accolades, and requisition points. Requisition points are used to purchase weapons, perks, and heraldry, and is also obtained by doing pretty much any activity in the game. Though I would suggest using it on upgrading your class perks and weapons before you go crazy on drip, unless you really want to rep a particular chapter in-game. Now, accolades differ from requisition. They are only used to purchase heroic weapons and unique armor customization in the Refinement and Redemption store. This store can be found to the right of the main Armory Hall by talking to the Mechanicus member over here. At the moment, accolades are exclusively earned in the Stratagems mode by completing missions on a daily and weekly rotation, making it the most valuable currency in-game. Now, the final area on the Battle Barge we'll be talking about is the Data Vault. This is where you can see your progress on ordeals, which are in-game challenges for every mode. By completing these, you do obtain research points, which are spent to purchase a few unique cosmetics in the game. Currently, these unlocks are a little undercooked, and most of the best cosmetics are purchased through the Accolade store. Though that is pretty much everything from major stores and game hubs, so now it's time to talk about some of the more specific combat mechanics in Space Marine 2, and expand on what the game's opening tutorial did not tell you. Space Marine 2 has 3 major PvE game modes. The first is called Operations, which has a total of 6 difficulties. The other game modes are Siege Mode and Stratagems. These modes both separate their difficulty into only 2 variants called Normal and Hard. We'll talk about those more later, because the first one we're going to go over here is the Operations mode. This is the intended game mode for players to start on and has had 2 additional difficulties added to it since launch. Operations difficulty levels are categorized as minimal, average, substantial, ruthless, lethal, and of course, absolute difficulty. The first, minimal difficulty, is something that most players will barely engage with, since it's really only intended for brand new players. This mode has fewer enemies, plenty of equipment drops, and even your stims will heal 50% of your total HP rather than the usual 35%. You also take 0 damage from your own equipment, and you have an increased revive speed on top of requiring 2 downs to get a mortal wound. Your dodge windows are also more generous, and you have a respawn timer of only 1 minute if you actually do end up dying. The next difficulty is called Average with a recommended level of 5, and this is the one I would suggest new players start at, as it is mostly the same as minimal, except the enemies are slightly stronger, and you'll start taking 25% damage from your own equipment with reduced pickup spawns overall. This is also the difficulty you will start finding mastercrafted armory data, which is mandatory for leveling your starting equipment, so the sooner you start collecting these, the better. The mid-tier difficulty is called Substantial. Suggested level requirement for this one is level 10, and this is where things will start getting a bit more intense for brand new players, as enemies get yet another buff to HP, and the player's armor and health on top of their perfect dodge and invulnerability windows are reduced once more. One down on substantial is all it takes to receive a mortal wound, and your overall equipment drops are reduced once again, yet your respawn timer remains 1 minute like all previous difficulties. This is a difficulty you will also start to see Artificer tier armory data, so it is a necessary step for most players in their progression through weapon tiers before they get to the even higher level difficulties. The difficulty after this is called Ruthless. This has a suggested level of 15 and was the highest option available at launch. This is where enemy HP caps out for standard operations, and your perfect dodge window, invulnerability window, and armor are reduced even further, on top of the player receiving more damage. Self-inflicted damage from your equipment goes up to 50% here, so start to be careful with your grenades, and ammo caches will also no longer be a source of infinite ammo and will instead restore your max ammo capacity a limited amount of times before they run out. The player's respawn time increases from 1 minute to 2 minutes here, and this is the first difficulty that Relic tier armory data can be found that is required for the highest tier of standard weapon variants. The next difficulty is called Lethal with a suggested level of 25. This is the first of two challenge difficulties that are intended for players who want more in the standard armory data grind of the previous difficulty options, and this is also where player health and armor reductions cap out. Ammo caches will also restore even less ammo before they run out, and your respawn timer is further increased from 2 to 5 minutes. However, every execute of a Majoris or higher enemy will reduce your teammates' respawn time by 20 seconds. The time enemies remain execution state here is also reduced by 50%, and one of the most major changes is that players can encounter multiple extremis packs at once, so watch out for those double lictors. Possibly the most frustrating mechanic on this difficulty though is the enrage mechanic. On lethal difficulty and above, when a Majoris enemy dies, gets their reinforcement call interrupted, or they are the last one alive, they can become what is called enraged. This is represented by a glowing red or purple aura around them. They will receive a full heal upon going enraged, alongside a dramatic buff to their damage and immunity to all but the most powerful staggering effects like block weapon explosions. Players need to be mindful of enraged enemies because they are some of the most damaging enemies in the entire game, though thankfully only Majoris can go enraged, and Extremis plus Terminus level enemies are left unaffected by this mechanic. If players complete all missions on lethal difficulty, they are rewarded with a special survivor helmet as well. The final difficulty in operations is called Absolute. This is very similar to lethal difficulty, with the major changes being that you can encounter Extremis packs of 3 and 2 bosses in a single operation. Bosses on this difficulty will spawn with a pack of Majoris and potentially Extremis, and upon being reduced below 50%, they will call in further reinforcements. This can prove incredibly challenging for many players, but the player is rewarded with an armory data for every single boss they defeat on top of on-map pickups. Upon completing all difficulties on Absolute, the player is also rewarded with a unique pauldron. If you feel comfortable, you can jump into difficulties like Ruthless and Lethal early, but usually making sure you have the proper relic weapons and perks before jumping into Lethal or above is the best idea. Now, the Stratagems mode functions a bit differently from Operations. Stratagems are daily and weekly rotated operations that will have both positive and negative modifiers. Here there are only two difficulties I mentioned previously, with normal and hard. Normal difficulty is based on substantial difficulty from operations, and hard mode is based on absolute difficulty. Now hard mode also has a hidden modifier on top of the base difficulty and spawns of absolute mode, which is that players will deal 15% less damage and receive 30% more damage. The difficulty of a hard stratagem can still vary drastically beyond this, thanks to a multitude of battlefield conditions that can both help and hinder you depending on the mission. Some examples of these are conditions like you only live once, which can make your mission significantly harder by making it so you only have one life if you go down, or Laramon cells, which can make your stratagems far easier. If you want a full list of these conditions, I will leave a link to them on the Space Marine 2 wiki in the description below, but stratagems are the intended endgame content of Space Marine 2 currently, and they have a rotation of both daily and weekly missions that will reward you with the valuable accolades currency. This currency can be used to purchase heroic weapon variants and unique armor pieces, so stratagems are a pretty valuable thing overall. The final PvE mode is Siege mode. Siege mode, like stratagems, only has a normal and hard difficulty option, but the normal difficulty in Siege mode, unlike the stratagems, is based on average difficulty, and the hard Siege mode is based on lethal difficulty. Now, Siege mode has a wave system that progressively gets more difficult, with wave 5 having you encounter one boss spawn, wave 10 having you encounter 2 simultaneous boss spawns, and wave 15 having you encounter the fabled triple boss spawns on simultaneously. Independent of which difficulty you play, starting at wave 16, you enter what is called endless waves, and the player deals 2.5% less damage and will receive 5% more damage every wave up to wave 45, where it caps at 75% less damage dealt and 150% more damage taken. Now, the vast majority of players will not have to encounter the ridiculous damage enemies can actually deal at these higher waves, but you should keep in mind that enemies do get ridiculous at the upper levels of this mode. Siege mode will reward you with unique colored weapon skins randomly for completing each section, and a unique helmet if you complete wave 15 or higher on hard mode. There are 25 levels for every class in Space Marine 2. To level your class, you obviously require experience points, and the main purpose of leveling your class is to gain access to new class perks in your perk tree. Now, simply leveling does not grant you immediate access to new perks. You'll have to purchase them with requisition points in your perk tree before you're actually able to equip them. Requisition points are granted by pretty much every activity in the game, and you can also purchase them by using armory data in the Accolade store. Now, after reaching level 25 in a given class, you are granted the opportunity to prestige. Prestiging will reset your class level back to 1 and will also reset your entire perk tree. There are a maximum of 4 prestige ranks per class, and every time you prestige, you will gain a permanent 10% XP boost and are allowed to choose 1 prestige perk out of 7. Any perks that you purchase before prestiging will not be refunded, and you will also have to repurchase them again when you reach the proper level requirement. This sounds worse than it actually is, as the cost of perks is not very expensive, but having to re-level to unlock them can be a bit tedious, since you do lose access to some of the most entertaining builds in the game. The next thing we're going to cover here are the weapon levels. Now, leveling your weapons is a bit more involved than leveling your class, since it requires not only XP, but also the armory data resource. Weapons are categorized into 5 tiers, which are the standard issue tier, master crafted tier, artificer tier, relic tier, and of course the heroic tier. Now, heroic weapons function a bit differently from the first 4 weapon tiers, as these are unique variants that are purchased in the Accolade store, and because of this, we're going to be talking about heroics more later and focus on the primary 4 weapon tiers first. To progress your weapon tiers, you are required to level the overall XP of your chosen weapon. This is represented by this bar and has 4 increments. Once you reach the required XP for a weapon tier, to actually unlock the next tier of weapon, you have to use an armory data of an equivalent level or above. Armory data is a currency that can be found throughout operation and stratagem maps in set locations, and they are also granted for killing on-map terminus enemies and mission bosses. You are also able to get armory data by completing siege mode, but this is really more of a bonus for reaching higher waves in this mode, rather than an efficient way of obtaining it. You can also exchange 3 lower tier armory data to gain 1 of a higher tier in the Accolade store. So this is how we gain access to higher tiers of weapons, but on top of leveling your overall weapon XP, each variant within a tier has its own XP bar and is purchased with requisition points. Every time you max out a weapon variant, you are granted 1 weapon perk point to use in your weapon's perk tree, and you will also get another weapon perk point when you max out your weapon's overall tier XP bar here as well. Another way of maxing your weapon variants without actually having to level them up with XP is by spending an equivalent or higher tier armory data on a weapon variant instead. This is really useful if you hate playing with a certain weapon defense type, or you gain a new weapon tier before you've maxed out all the weapon variants in a previous tier. This is one of the better quality of life features in the entire game, and got that much better after they added the Accolade store, since you can actually get armory data of different types much more easily now. Now, the final thing I want to mention on leveling your weapons is that if you gain some ridiculous amount of XP for completing a high difficulty mission that would go above the XP you need for the next tier of weapon you're using, this XP does not transfer over to the next tier, and you will have to purchase that tier, then level it up in the same way as the previous one. Your weapon XP is also shared with class XP, so you're able to level both simultaneously. Now that we've explained how the first 4 weapon tiers and levels work, let's go back and talk about heroic weapon variants. Unlike the other 4 tiers, these do not have any level requirement or mastery to them at all. All you have to do is purchase one in the Accolade store, and they'll be available for you to use. This makes them a pretty useful tool for leveling your overall weapon tiers, as they have relic level stats and can be used at level 1. Though you do need the required accolades and will still have to master the other weapon variants to get maximum perk points in your perk tree. But speaking of weapon variants, which weapons should you prioritize while leveling up your classes? In Space Marine 2, if the same weapon is usable by multiple classes, it will share progression across all of them. This means that weapons like the bolt pistol and heavy bolt pistol are incredibly valuable to max out first, as they are available on every single class. This makes it significantly easier to take an underlevel primary into slightly higher difficulties for leveling and not get completely outclassed by the enemies that are there. Other melee weapons like the chainsword and combat knife are also present on multiple classes, and ones that aren't can have their heroic variants purchased for leveling like I mentioned previously. So when you're leveling up, keep in mind what weapons are on which classes, as it will make your life far easier in the long run. So now that we know what weapons we should be prioritizing to make our leveling experience smoother and how leveling systems actually work for our weapons and classes, it's time to talk about the reason you're probably here, which is how we actually obtain experience and what the fastest ways to accomplish this actually are. Space Marine 2 has multiple ways to level your character, but the first of these options, and the one I think that most players should start on, is Operation. The amount of XP you get in Operations is dependent on multiple factors such as difficulty, whether or not you picked up the on-map gene seed, which we'll get into more later, and your team's extermination rank. Difficulty is pretty self-explanatory. The higher difficulty you pick, the more XP it will give you, with absolute difficulty granting you the highest total XP available to Operations. The Stratagems game mode will also grant you the same amount of XP as Operations for the respective modes, with normal difficulty being based on substantial and hard difficulty being based on absolute. Now, as you reach certain checkpoints in an operation or stratagem, you will progressively get XP even if you fail the mission. This is split into 5 different parts that grant about 10% of the total mission XP the further you progress, with the full payout being when you know, actually complete the mission. Throughout an operation mission, you can also find a gene seed pickup, and this will grant you an additional 30% XP, but if you die after you pick up the gene seed, it will be lost forever, and you will fail the Emperor, and everyone in your lobby will flame you. Your team's extermination rank that I mentioned briefly is based on how many enemies you kill throughout the mission. This functions as a multiplier to your XP. It's split into 3 ranks, which are C, B, and A, so playing through a mission properly is encouraged. As for which operations are the fastest for leveling, you really can't go wrong with the classic Decapitation. This is arguably the easiest mission in the entire game, as the Hive Tyrant is a boss the majority of the player base knows how to fight at this point, since it's been available since the launch, on top of being one of the shortest missions available. Tyranids are also generally easier to fight than Chaos for most players, and even Saber has admitted they believe this to be the case, so the majority of players will likely prefer leveling on Tyranid operations, but if you do want to fight Chaos, missions like Vox Liberatus can also be incredibly efficient alongside maps like Obelisk. The actual XP rates you get from completing these will vary between player skill levels and what difficulty you actually select, but my tip for this is play at a difficulty you are comfortable with, as pushing a difficulty far higher than your current weapon and class level can technically level you faster, but only if you actually complete the mission. So if you are somebody that goes on an endless cycle of suffering and rebirth, you're not going to get all that much XP at all, and will just be wasting your time by trying to punch above your weight class. Generally, going through the intended level brackets is a great way to learn the game and also unlock the operation armor requirements, and is what I would personally recommend, though I would suggest that most players start at average difficulty rather than minimal, as the vast majority of players are more than capable of completing this one right off the bat. You can also get a 20% XP buff to any difficulty if you select the quick match, and this is honestly a pretty fun way for you to learn the different operations in the game and avoid burnout, as while rushing XP is definitely an option, it can be incredibly boring and wasn't really the way the game was intended to be played. Every single melee weapon in the game has 3 stat types and 3 defense types. The weapon stats are categorized as strength, speed, and cleave, and the defense types are categorized as fencing, balanced, and block. Now, the first thing we'll be talking about are the weapon stats, starting with strength. This stat is pretty self-explanatory and affects your weapon's overall damage, letting your attacks hit harder against enemies so you get to, actually kill them, which is kind of the whole point of your melee weapon in the first place. And the weapon defense types that have the highest base strength stats are balance and block, with block being the highest damage per hit overall. You should also keep in mind that a specific strength number on one weapon type is not one-to-one with another weapon type, so just because you might see a Thunderhammer that has 14 strength and a Chainsword that has 16 strength, it does not mean that the Chainsword is going to hit harder than the Thunderhammer, so think about it as a number to compare to other weapons of the same type. Now, the next weapon stat we'll talk about here is the speed stat. This simply affects the speed of your weapon attacks, including your light combos and heavy attack combos, such as the Chainsword bashes and stomps. However, the charge rate of your charge attacks, such as the Thunderhammer's Aftershock or the Power Fist Thrust Jab, are not affected by the stat directly at all, pretty much. This makes a weapon like the Block Power Fist incredibly powerful in the game, since despite its speed stat of 1, most of this weapon's damage comes from the charge attacks like Thrust Jab that are left unaffected. Now, the speed stat is a very useful stat to have in Space Marine 2 for obvious reasons, and now unfortunately, light attack combos in Space Marine 2 do currently leave a lot to be desired in terms of damage, but being able to get your attacks in more quickly to stagger enemies and just fit damage into enemy attack gaps is still a very useful thing overall. The final stat we'll be talking about here is of course the cleave stat, and this is probably the most confusing for people, and the way this one works is that cleave will affect the maximum amount of enemies you can hit and deal damage to. So if you have a low cleave, you will still stagger multiple enemies the impact of your attack, but to actually deal damage to everyone you hit, they cannot exceed the maximum cleave value of your weapon. So that may all sound pretty simple. You have a higher cleave, you hit more enemies. That is the baseline of what this weapon stat does, but the reason that this gets confusing is because the way this weapon stat actually works is that it will add on a cleave value to the base cleave of your weapon attack, because every single attack in Space Marine 2 has an independent cleave value that is separate from the weapon stat screen and is then modified by the weapon's cleave stat. Now you may be wondering what the hell that even means, so let's give an actual example with a chainsword. The base cleave of a chainsword stomp is 8. This means that your stomp on the chainsword, independent of all other factors, can damage up to 8 enemies at once with the stomp attack. If you have a chainsword with a cleave stat of 10, like the balanced chainsword variant, that means your chainsword stomp can now hit a maximum of 18 enemies and actually deal damage to them. So yes, it is needlessly confusing, and there is nothing in the game telling you what the cleave stat of your weapon attacks even are. However, you are able to find all of these values on the game's wiki, which I will leave a link to in the description below. Hopefully that explains what these stats actually do, since I know this can get confusing for a lot of players. And if the base cleave of the weapon attacks was not confusing enough because you have no idea what they are, some of the in-game values are also represented incorrectly, because a fencing chainsword, despite having a cleave of 1, actually has a -2, so keep that in mind. Something that is also incredibly unexplained in Space Marine 2 are the weapon defense types and how parrying or block even work. Some of these weapon types have been completely changed since the launch of the game and don't even resemble their initial gameplay loop from a year ago, which is why we are going to go through all of them and give a detailed explanation on what the hell they actually do and their major differences. Both fencing and balanced weapons are capable of performing a perfect parry. Now, perfect parries will deflect an enemy attack and open them up for further hits, and a successful parry will also stagger all enemies within 4.5 meters for a balanced weapon and 2 meters for a fencing weapon. Now, one of the biggest draws of perfect parry weapons is that you will get a gunstrike opportunity on a perfect parry for even more damage on a follow-up attack, and you will also be able to use your perfect parry to fend off Minoris enemies, which will instantly kill the parried enemy and restore 1 armor segment. This is a really good tool for horde control against Minoris for every type of player, but new players especially will benefit from this mechanic, since it does not require you to understand gunstrike setup loops to restore armor, and you can simply parry the Minoris swarms instead. Now, block weapons have an entirely different mechanic from the perfect parry. They are able to perfect block instead, which we'll get into more later, but both perfectly parried and perfectly blocked enemies receive a 50% increased damage taken debuff for 2.2 seconds, which you can tell is active with a yellow glow around the affected enemy. Now, the fencing defense type is far and away the most popular and forgiving of the 3 options. They prioritize the speed stat at the cost of damage and cleave to quickly cut through enemies and fend off Minoris swarms in between gunstrikes on Majoris and higher level enemies. The defining feature of a fencing weapon is their incredibly large perfect parry window. The parry window of a fencing weapon lasts for 40 frames and has 0 startup frames. 0 startup frames is the most important part of this, because this means that the moment you press the input for your weapon, you will immediately start parrying an enemy attack. This is especially useful for rapidly attacking enemies like Lictors or Chaos Spawn that have fewer gaps between their attacks, especially in large groups, which are one of the hardest things for a lot of players to deal with. Now, the next defense type we'll talk about is the balanced defense type. Balanced weapons are slightly slower than fencing weapons, with tremendously higher base stats for strength and cleave. Their major downside, however, comes from their parry window, which is currently the worst in the game. Balanced weapons have a 10 frame negative startup on their parry window and a 30 frame active parry window for their perfect parries. What this means is that the first 10 frames after pressing your parry button, it is literally impossible for you to achieve a perfect parry. If you do perfect parry an enemy during this 10 frame window, you will instead enter an animation where you block the enemy attack and you take no damage, but you are also left slightly staggered and you have no gunstrike opportunity. So basically, you have to preemptively press your parry key before an enemy attack actually hits you if you want to achieve a perfect parry on a balanced weapon as a sort of wind-up. This is one of the most limiting features in the game, and in some cases, it can outright get you killed by stacked enemy attacks. Still though, a lot of players do enjoy the higher stats on these weapons while also having some kind of option for parrying, and balanced weapons can still be taken into the higher difficulty content with minimal issues. The final weapon defense type we'll be covering here today is Block. Now, on the launch of Space Marine 2, this was a truly trash tier weapon type with zero benefit beyond mediocre stat increases over the other variants and lacked any real utility like perfect parrying. Currently, however, it is the overall strongest in the game, though it is also the hardest to use. Valuing the strength stat and having the lowest speed stat in the entire game, Block weapons completely give up perfect parrying for the perfect block mechanic to deal tremendous amounts of damage to enemy hordes and bosses. Like the fencing defense type, block weapons have a 0 frame startup for their perfect block, so will trigger immediately off your button press, though the actual active parry window to receive a perfect block on an enemy is only 20 frames compared to the 40 on a fencing weapon. Now, unlike perfect parries, perfect block does not stagger the enemy directly and will instead grant you 1 stack of adrenaline surge charges up to a maximum of 2. But what does an adrenaline stack even do for you? Well, this is actually one of the most potent mechanics in the entire game, and the first stack of adrenaline surge you get gives you a 30% melee damage buff for 2.4 seconds the next time you do any melee attack. At 2 charges of Adrenaline Surge, this damage bonus goes up to a 90% boost for 2.4 seconds, on top of causing a massive explosion that knocks back enemies within 4.5 meters, restores 1 armor segment, and makes your attack stagger any enemy hit for the duration of the effect, including bosses. You are also able to see the current amount of Adrenaline Surge charges in the upper left of your screen under your health bar with this icon. You should keep in mind that these stacks will linger for 35 seconds after you initially gain them, but if you attack for any reason, you will trigger the 2.4 second buff even if you don't hit any enemies at all. When you get a stack of Adrenaline Surge, you can also hear the iconic block ping, and you will also get a 60% range damage reduction for 2 seconds. This range damage reduction is incredibly powerful because there are many times in Space Marine 2 that you are simply under fire from enemies like Tyranid Devourers or Rubric Marines while being forced to parry, where this can absolutely save your life. The biggest thing that Block struggles with, however, is recovering CHP easily off of a Gunstrike and being unable to perfect parry Minoras for armor. Though you can still perfect block them to gain Adrenaline Surge charges and then regain armor that way, this is a lot harder to pull off for most players. Now you might be thinking, wow, block weapons sure do a lot of stuff, and surely there must be a tutorial for that in the game somewhere, right? Well, the answer is a big fat no, and there is zero explanation for any of these weapon mechanics outside of a patch note from nearly a year ago. Space Marine 2 in general is in desperate need of a better tutorial, but considering we only have 3 defense types in the game, surely we can have like a little text bubble that tells players this stuff. Now, regardless of which weapon types are overall stronger, every single weapon type in Space Marine 2 can perform well in operations, hard stratagems, and even siege mode outside of ridiculously high waves. So basically, use whatever the hell you feel like or whatever fits your chosen build and playstyle better. Don't feel inclined to use only the strongest weapons because you heard they are the best. There are 3 major survival mechanics in Space Marine 2. These are categorized as your health, armor, and contested health. The first of these that we will be going over is the most important one, which is your health. This is represented by the red bar on the upper left of your screen, and when this hits 0, you will enter an incapacitated state, and if not revived by your teammates in time, you will simply die. If you are revived after going into this incapacitated state, you can receive what is called a mortal wound, which is represented by this icon, and if your HP hits 0 again while this is active, you will die with 0 chance to be revived by your team. Whether you receive a mortal wound upon your first down is dependent on difficulty, with substantial and above giving you a mortal wound immediately after your first down, and the lower difficulties giving you 1 after multiple downs. Now, mortal wounds can be removed multiple ways. The first one is by overhealing your health bar with a Medicae stim, or by utilizing the much rarer Guardian Relic, which we'll get into more later. The visual representation of your health bar can be deceptive, however, because there is a hidden mechanic in Space Marine 2 that dramatically increases your effective HP compared to what you would expect from where your health bar is actually at. When your health reaches 25% of its maximum, you will start to get a ramping health damage reduction that caps out at 30% when you reach 1% HP. And then from 1% of your HP to 0 HP, 0 HP obviously being when you die, this damage reduction will cap out at a total of 80%. This is why there are so many perks in Space Marine 2 that function at such low health values, such as Adamant Hunter or Patience Rewarded, and why it feels like there is such a discrepancy in your overall damage taken. Because being at risk of dropping below 25% health is not as bad as it seems initially. This is also part of the reason that base HP increases are so damn valuable in this game, because having an increasing starting HP with perks like Fortitude or the Bulwark means that your effective HP becomes even higher when a class of these perks drops below 25% health. So when you're playing Space Marine 2, be mindful of your HP, but you don't need to be utterly terrified when your bar begins to drop. The next major defensive mechanic we'll be talking about is armor. This is your primary safeguard against health damage in Space Marine 2 and is represented by these icons under your HP bar. The total amount of armor available to you depends on the class you are playing, with Tactical, Heavy, Assault, and Bulwark having a total of 3, and Vanguard or Sniper only having a total of 2. Armor will absorb damage for you until it runs out, and once this happens, you will start taking health damage directly. Now, unlike health, your armor can be fairly easily restored through things like Gunstrikes on Minoris enemies, executions on Majoris or higher enemies, and perk effects like Focus Restoration or on-map pickups such as Armor Boost. How long your armor actually lasts, however, depends on what you're fighting and what actually hits you. In Space Marine 2, every melee hit has a fixed damage amount against your armor. For example, a standard hit from a Sword Warrior will deal 1 armor bar in damage, and a Carnifex will shred 2 bars of your armor as a baseline. But one of the most powerful tools of armor against melee attacks is that regardless of how much armor you have remaining, any single incoming melee hit will never deal overkill damage to your armor and damage your HP bar. This is why drip-fed armor restore effects like Focus Restoration or Trick Shot are so powerful in Space Marine 2, because they provide you damage caps against attacks that would otherwise be able to outright one-shot you at a low HP. Now, ranged attacks against your armor do function a bit differently from melee attacks. Enemy range damage can deal damage to your HP bar if the range attack is strong enough to break your armor first. For example, a Tyrannid Venom Cannon Warrior can shoot you from full HP and armor, ripping right through not only your armor but also damaging your health in the process. Your armor will still lower the HP damage you would have otherwise taken, but this is part of the reason why ranged enemies in Space Marine 2 can be so deadly. Though I should mention that ranged damage reduction perks do affect your armor as well, reducing the total damage taken, and once your armor is broken by this diminished range attack, any active health damage reduction perks you have, like Conviction, are also taken into account, diminishing the damage you take even further. Another important thing to mention is that when your armor is completely empty, it will automatically restore itself after a 25-second cooldown on Ruthless difficulty and below, and a 50-second cooldown on Lethal difficulty and above. You are also able to regen 1 armor bar from any execute on Minoris or above, and your entire team will be granted 3 armor bars when you execute a Terminus level enemy. Hopefully you now better understand the defensive power that armor can grant you, as once you learn to better manage this mechanic, the health damage you take throughout your operations will be significantly reduced. But what do we do when we fail to prevent health damage? Well, there is a final failsafe in the game for this called Contested HP or CHP. When you take direct health damage in Space Marine 2, your health will have a white bar appear. This is your contested health, and it will fade over time with a 2-second initial delay, and this delay can be improved with team perks like Advanced Conditioning. But any damage you deal while this white bar is active will recover your lost HP. The actual amount restored varies greatly depending on multiple factors, but heavier hitting attacks will restore more CHP, and currently in the game, ranged weapons have a disproportionately high amount of CHP recovery compared to melee weapons. The developers at Saber Interactive have stated they intend to change this to favor melee weapons in the future, but for now, ranged weapons like Plasma and Melta are incredibly potent sources of contested health and simply reign supreme. Another incredibly easy way of recovering your CHP is by executing enemies. Both Minoris and Majoris will recover your entire contested health bar when you execute them, and a Terminus level execute will restore the contested health for your entire team. There are also perk effects in the game that grant you CHP recovery, such as the Sniper's Purification perk or the Chainsword's Swift Recovery weapon perk. Properly managing contested health regen alongside your armor regen is the most important thing to stay alive in this game and save yourself some resources. And speaking of resources, there are multiple pickups in Space Marine 2, such as the Medicae stims that I mentioned previously, that will significantly help you with everything we just talked about. Medicae stims are found throughout both operations and siege mode maps. Each player can hold a maximum of 2, and upon use, they will heal 30% of your HP, and on top of this, they will also restore any missing contested health and still give you back the initial 30% heal. This means that by saving your stims for an incredibly dangerous moment, you can get back more HP than using them immediately upon pickup, though this can leave you open to potentially getting damage nukes, so it depends on the situation. The next pickup is called the Armor Boost. These will take effect the moment you pick them up, restoring any missing armor segments and granting you a temporary 4th armor bar. This is impossible to recover once lost, but will help you out in some further damage reduction. The final pickup we will be talking about is the previously mentioned Guardian Relic. Guardian Relics are one of the strongest tools for survival in Space Marine 2, allowing the player to selectively auto-revive upon being incapacitated. When a Guardian Relic revives you, you'll return with 30% of your total HP recovered, on top of your remaining health bar being granted full contested health, giving you a chance to return to a fresh state. The greatest benefit of a Guardian Relic is that if you have a mortal wound present and go down, the Guardian Relic will automatically revive you and clear the mortal wound. This can be absolutely life-saving and change the course of your entire mission. Guardian Relics can be found in randomized locations around the map, and they will take the place of a Gene Seed pickup, as you cannot carry both simultaneously. Gunstrikes can be obtained in Space Marine 2 3 different ways. The first is by perfectly parrying an enemy with a balanced or fencing weapon. The second is by achieving a perfect dodge on an enemy, and the final way to do this is by setting up a Gunstrike with your melee weapon attack, such as the Aftershock on the Thunderhammer. Once you have a Gunstrike active, this red target icon will appear on the affected enemy, and the next time you fire your gun while you are not aiming down your sights, you will perform a Gunstrike. Now, unlike executes, you are not invulnerable during this animation, and the enemy can interrupt you mid-gunstrike, staggering you and potentially incapacitating you. This is part of what makes perk effects like Indomitable Spirit or Heightened Vigor so valuable, since they will stop interruptions from standard enemy attacks. You should keep in mind when you have a Gunstrike available, it is impossible for you to hip fire your weapon, as the hip fire and Gunstrike key are permanently bound together, which is pretty damn annoying if I'm being real, but it's just the way the game works currently. Even though you can only have one Gunstrike active at a time, multiple Gunstrikes can be stacked on the same enemy multiple times over if you perfect parry or dodge them consecutively without gunstriking them immediately. You are also able to completely skip an execution animation for a Gunstrike instead if you do any type of melee hit on an enemy that is in an execute state, as this will grant you a Gunstrike opportunity instead. This is incredibly useful for things like Tactical's Radiating Impact perk if you want to save yourself a 90-second cooldown by not triggering a melee execute. Any Gunstrike that kills a Minoris, Majoris, or Extremis will restore 1 bar of armor for you, with Terminus level enemies restoring 3 armor bars for your entire team. There are also perks like Armor Reinforcement that will grant you armor on non-lethal Gunstrikes, which are incredibly powerful sources of survivability in Space Marine 2 and make gunstriking significantly safer. Upon gunstriking an enemy, you will stagger them and other enemies in close proximity on top of dealing direct damage to the enemy hit. Despite shooting the enemy in the face, however, Gunstrikes will not trigger any headshot perks and are not affected by headshot damage buffs. The actual damage you do with a Gunstrike is dependent on multiple factors, such as difficulty and perk effects like Proven Efficiency, but the most important factor is your secondary weapon selection. The higher tier your secondary weapon, the more damage it will do in a Gunstrike, with the highest Gunstrike damage being dependent on the base damage of your secondary. This means that firepower variants tend to have the highest Gunstrike damage overall out of other relic tier options, and certain unique heroic variants like the Heavy Bolt Pistol's Retribution's Bequest having even higher damage. Now, to simplify this, the highest Gunstrike damage secondaries in the game in order from strongest to weakest, and not including perk effects, are the Heroic Heavy Bolt Pistol, Firepower Heavy Bolt Pistol, Firepower Bolt Pistol, Standard Heavy Bolt Pistol, Standard Bolt Pistol, Plasma Pistol, Neo-Volkite Firepower variant, Heroic Bolt Pistol, Standard Neo-Volkite Pistol, Firepower Inferno Pistol, and finally the Standard Inferno Pistol. That is quite the mouthful, and there are perk effects like Power Strike on the Power Axe that can change this ranking a little bit, but as a baseline, this is the ranking of secondary Gunstrike damage in the game. Now, some of these also have special effects. For example, the plasma pistol can hit up to 3 adjacent enemies with a gunstrike, also damaging them, including the original target. The Inferno pistol, despite its horrible gunstrike damage, is also able to mass AoE stagger enemies with its gunstrikes, which is pretty useful against things like Chaos Spawn, though this is also the only weapon in the entire game that has a limited range on its gunstrikes that limits it even further. Gunstrikes, like other sources of damage, will also restore your contested health, but the amount restored is dependent on how much gunstrike damage you actually deal. This is one of the most attractive things about fencing weapons for many players, as this is an easy way to recover lost HP after a parry, even if you previously took damage. There are also many perks in the game that will function off your gunstrike, such as the Gunstrike Reload Weapon perk, which will instantly reload your gun after you gunstrike, or the Heroic Heavy Bolter's Weapon perk, Reinforced Gun Casing, which will completely cool your weapon after performing a gunstrike. It is also important to mention that any lunging melee attack in Space Marine 2, such as the Power Fist Cannon Punch or the Chainsword's Whirl Slash, will also set up a gunstrike on the majority of Minoris enemies. The only enemies that this does not work on immediately are the Shield Zangors, because they are simply built different, and the Cultists, because they are also built different, just in a worse way. Once you learn to properly incorporate gunstrike loops on Minoris like this and better understand the trades and timings on Majoris and higher enemies, Space Marine 2 becomes significantly easier, and you shouldn't be afraid to experiment more with perfect dodges either, since perfect dodge is also an excellent way to improve the amount of gunstrikes you get throughout your game. Classes like Assault and Vanguard excel at this thanks to Assault's 50% increased dodge window starting perk, and the Vanguard's conditional perk Hone Reactions that gives a 100% increased perfect dodge window. The final thing I want to note here is that perks that trigger off of range kills like Tenacity on the Vanguard do not trigger off of gunstrikes, which is a question many people have asked me previously. There are currently 7 classes in Space Marine 2. Now, the Tech Marine is not available for everyone just yet as of when I am making this video, but it will be very soon and might already be by the time you're watching this. So how do the classes in this game actually play? Well, the first one we're going to talk about is the Tactical class. Tactical is the premier range support class of Space Marine 2, able to dish out tremendous amounts of single target range damage with weapons like the Stalker Bolt Rifle and Mass Horde Clear, as well with the Melter Rifle or Pyre Blaster. In fact, the Tactical's range weapon selection is the largest in the entire game, with a pretty heavy focus on bolter weapons, and you're also able to hugely buff your team's damage output with his signature class ability, the Auspex Scan. This will fire out a targeted scan area that will mark enemies, making them take more damage from both you and your teammates. This class ability is probably the single most powerful in-game currently, as it really is the ultimate enabler for your entire team's DPS to dish out a ridiculous amount of burst damage against high-threat enemies like bosses. Tactical really is the greatest ally any team comp can ask for, with perks that will regenerate equipment for your entire squad and being able to nuke down some of the more annoying enemies in the game like Zoanthropes all on his own. The major thing this class struggles with is survivability, however, as he is the definition of a glass cannon and does have a bit of a learning curve compared to some of the other classes we'll get into later, but when played properly, he is still one of the best classes in the entire game. So if massive range damage and support perks are your thing, Tactical will likely fit your playstyle perfectly, and he's a pretty well-designed class overall. The next class we're going to cover here is Assault. The Assault class is a highly mobile, incredibly damaging melee class that truly shines when it comes to massive enemy clumps and enormous amounts of burst damage on top of armor regen. This class has gone through a serious redemption arc over the game's lifespan, since during the initial launch of Space Marine 2, he was by far the most undercooked class, but over a year later, with multiple new weapons and major balance changes, the Assault is a very powerful class, albeit a bit harder to play for some players. Your signature move is the Ground Pound, which has you launch into the air with your jump pack, only to crater back to the earth to deal huge area damage and stagger stronger enemies that survive. The Assault's ability to wipe out massive hordes with staggering amounts of melee damage and dish out the highest gunstrike damage in the game can almost trivialize certain encounters, but he's not without some major downsides. This class has access to the majority of melee weapons in the game, such as the Power Axe or the Power Sword and the incredibly popular Thunder Hammer, though unlike most other classes, the Assault only has access to a secondary range weapon, which does make him struggle more versus certain enemies that other classes or other range classes would be able to body. The reason this class can be a bit hard to pick up initially is that he does require you to understand more of the game's melee and armor mechanics, and what situations are worth ground pounding into and which ones will just straight up get you killed. Though if you do master the Assault, he is one of the most dominant classes in the current state of the game. He's also one of the most fun to play in general. The next class we're going to talk about here is the Vanguard. Vanguard functions as far more of a hybrid class, having access to a primary, secondary, and melee weapon with a slightly greater focus on melee combat. Your signature class ability is the Grapnel Hook, allowing you to lash onto enemies and pull yourself directly into melee combat against large hordes, or catching out annoying enemy ranged units like Devourers. This can even be used to make some strategic exits, though the grapnel targeting does leave a lot to be desired and can get you killed at times. One of the greatest draws of the Vanguard class is that he has access to both self and team healing in his perk tree, alongside more popular ranged weapons like the Melter Rifle. And while he may not be as damaging in melee as a class like Assault, he makes up for this by being able to survive off very few pickups and being less susceptible to chip damage from enemy range fire thanks to a plethora of damage reduction perks on top of his heals. All of this makes him an excellent class for newer players, as being able to heal from enemy damage and having more AoE based stagger weapons like the Melter Rifle I previously mentioned will help a lot of people learn the game when they are just starting out. The Vanguard only particularly struggles with burst damage, as currently only his Execute build can do dramatic horde clear damage, but that being said, he's more than capable of tackling harder content like hard stratagems, and his team perks are great for support regardless. So if pulling yourself into the enemy horde and surviving in a war of attrition sounds like your thing, you should probably try out the Vanguard class. The next class is one of, if not the strongest class in the entirety of Space Marine 2, which is the Bulwark. The Bulwark is the tank support melee class of Space Marine 2, boasting a ridiculous amount of damage reduction and increased starting HP on top of some of the strongest melee weapons the game has, like the Power Fist. Your class ability, the Chapter Banner, puts down a choke point for your team that will regenerate armor for you and your allies, on top of being able to deal AoE damage with the proper perk selection. So you might be thinking that because of all of his damage reduction and increased HP, the Bulwark must struggle with dealing damage, right? Well, not really. This class actually puts out a ridiculous amount of damage as well, thanks to his damage on parry perks and prestige perks that give him even more damage increases, on top of access to the two best melee weapons in the game. And on top of all of this, he also has a shield that he can block 100% of incoming range damage with, even while he is moving, on top of a shield rush attack to stagger enemies and the ability to heal himself and his teammates to full HP with his banner. Bulwark really is just that guy and is an incredible class for new players, similar to Vanguard, and is one of the most popular classes in the game for this reason. The only downside to Bulwark is that, like the Assault class, he doesn't have a proper primary weapon and is instead limited to melee and a secondary exclusively, but to be honest, this doesn't really hurt him as much as you'd think, since defending against enemy range attacks is quite easy thanks to your shield, and overall, this guy is just kind of on crack. So if holding the line and carrying the Gene Seed for your brothers while you cave in Tyranid Skulls sounds enticing to you, then the Bulwark is probably the best class choice you could make. This brings us to the Sniper class. Now, Sniper is a long-range single target damage dealer in Space Marine 2, if a class name didn't make that obvious, boasting a major focus on burst range damage and also shockingly high melee damage. Your class ability is the Camo Cloak, allowing you to temporarily go invisible to gain damage bonuses for either your ranged or melee attacks that can even let you outright one-shot certain powerful enemies in the game. The intended gameplay loop of the Sniper will have you going in and out of stealth throughout the entire mission to set up equipment like melt-a-bombs in strategic locations, and to regain your contested health, as the Sniper with the proper perk selection is shockingly good at survival. He has multiple unique range weapons like the Bolt Sniper Rifle and the Last Fusel, which are not only fun to use but incredibly effective, though results may vary depending on your aim, with the Bolt Sniper Rifle being one of the higher skill cap weapons in the entirety of Space Marine 2. His melee weapon selection is far more limited, as you are permanently stuck to only a combat knife, but this is really all you need, as the Shadow Stab single target ability on this thing fits the Sniper playstyle perfectly. The major downside of the Sniper is that his horde clear is a bit lacking unless you use his equipment regen with a Melt-a-Bomb, as on his own he doesn't have an immediate answer to a swarm of enemies in his face. But that's really by design, because after all, he is intended to be a single target damage class, not a walking AoE apocalypse, though he can definitely fill that role with Melt-a-Bomb spam and the Pattern of Excellence perk. But if Sniper Rifles and a general focus on single target burst damage sounds like your cup of tea, then you will probably love the Sniper class, and your team will thank you, because it is unlikely they will ever have to deal with a Zoanthrope again if you are actually on point. Now, the next class we'll be talking about here is the Heavy. This class can be summed up as you shoot gun and have big armor to make sure you are able to keep shooting gun. When you can no longer parachute gun, you're gonna have a bad time. Where other classes like Vanguard and Tactical can swap between melee and range, the Heavy is almost exclusively a range class, having access to 0 melee weapons and some of the heaviest hitting primaries the game has on offer. Your class ability, the Iron Halo, deploys a mobile shield in front of you that follows your movements to absorb range damage until it is either depleted on its own or gets shattered by enemy fire. It is hard to properly describe with words the level of DACA achieved by the Heavy class. Weapons like the Heavy Bolter are able to shred through Chaos and Tyranid swarms alike, and things like the Heavy Plasma Incinerator make you question if the enemy even existed to begin with. Now, having a big gun is great and all, but what about second gun? What about tiny gun? Well, we also have access to the majority of tiny guns, also known as secondaries in the game. However, the major drawback of this class is that you have no access to melee weapons at all, and you only have your massive Gravis armored foot. And don't get me wrong, the foot is quite powerful and one of the best tools for getting rid of Minoris, but running out of ammo can be incredibly detrimental for this class, even with your ammo regen loadout. Though on top of being a massive range damage dealer, the Heavy can also be an incredibly tanky class, second only to the Bulwark, thanks to access to perks like Fortitude, Conviction, and Encompassing Aegis. So if a heavily armored range playstyle is what you were looking for out of Space Marine 2, this is by far the best pick. As for the next and final class, it is time for us to finally talk about the Tech Marine. This is Space Marine 2's only post-launch class added so far and boasts a very unique playstyle. Your class ability is called the Servo Gun, that functions as an AI-controlled shoulder-mounted cannon that targets enemies to blow them apart or light them on fire, with multiple variations such as a Plasma Incinerator version or a more sniper-focused precision shot variant. The most unique feature of the Tech Marine, however, is that he can gunstrike without going into an animation by firing his servo gun instead. This is incredibly useful and helps you not only deal extra damage against Majoris and higher enemies, but also just pick up free armor against Minoris you've knocked down while ripping through the swarm. The Tech Marine also has access to many of the same range weapons as Tactical, such as the Bolt Rifle and Plasma Incinerator, alongside some of the strongest melee weapons in the game, like the Power Axe. Not to mention his very own unique melee weapon, the Omniscient Axe, that lets him charge into battle with range damage reduction and skewer enemies before dispensing massive electrical explosions. This class also has access to the Tarantula Sentry Guns, which will spawn throughout your operations while you're playing as the Tech Marine, allowing you to activate them to help you defend key areas and have a fallback point for boss fights and other encounters. The major downside of the Tech Marine is that you are a glass cannon with very little resistance to getting staggered, which does make him one of the hardest classes to play in the game currently, though many of his features are also automated, which is easier in some ways than other classes the game currently offers. He is, however, a new class, so some growing pains are to be expected, and his overall playstyle is incredibly fun, and he is likely to get many positive changes, like every other class in this game since launch. So if praising the Omniscient and ripping apart Tyranids and Thousand Suns with your mechanical arm sounds appealing, this is the only class for you. Now, I'll say this up front that not every class in Space Marine 2 has an equivalent leveling experience. Classes like Assault simply have a harder time since perks like Zealous Blow and Commitment are so far down their perk tree, and perks like this are required to make things like a Wings of Flame build function at all. But that being said, every class still has a pretty decent leveling option, and we'll be going through all of those today, starting off with the Tactical class. Now, Tactical actually has a pretty easy time leveling up in Space Marine 2 because his first row of perks are godlike. He has things like Heightened Vigor and also the best team perk in the entire game with Secure Stockpile that gives you equipment back for your entire team, and also stuff like Battle Focus to apply Auspex scans on parry and blocks. So really good options here, and on top of that, his weapons are very good for punching up into higher difficulties and also very transferable to other classes because things like the Pyroblaster, the burn damage of this weapon will scale up with difficulty regardless of the tier or variant you're using, so a standard issue version can still put out a ton of burn damage even on absolute. So if you're playing with your friends that are higher levels and you're just trying to punch up and get some extra XP for your other weapons, this is a really good option, and because of that, you will be able to have an easier time leveling your Heavy Bolt Pistol, and your Plasma Pistol, and these two weapons in particular, they are on every single class in Space Marine 2, which means if you level them up on your Tactical first, you have an easier time on every other class in the game, so that's a pretty good option for sure. Now, one other thing I want to mention here is that the Heroic Heavy Bolt Rifle, this is coming into Patch 12 eventually. It's not in the official game just yet, but this is one of the only weapons that is transferable transferable on both the Heavy and the Tech Marine. Heavy predominantly only has like a Plasma, Multi-Melta, Pyrocan, Heavy Bolter that are only on him. This is the only weapon that is cross-class for him besides secondaries, which is why it's such a great option. And leveling up a Heavy Bolt Rifle is very easy if you take a heroic option, because as long as you have the required accolades to purchase a heroic weapon, you can use them right off the bat, even if you only have access to like a standard issue version on the base versions. Just keep that in mind. And the benefit of that is that the stats of these are all relic tier, which means you just punch up immediately. So a really good option there as well. Now, as far as the melee weapons you should level up first on the tactical, I would probably just go for the chainsword immediately. This weapon is on Vanguard, it's on Assault, it's on Bulwark, it's on Sniper Heavy or Tech Marine, but you know, you do have guns to level up simultaneously for them. So it's kind of like a catch-all. Like once you level up your tactical, if you have a maxed out chainsword, if you have a maxed out heavy bolt rifle, if you have a maxed out heavy bolt pistol, you will have an easier time leveling every single other class. So I would prioritize things like this at first, or your Pyro Blaster. Now for the perk tree, it's pretty self-explanatory. You just take Secure Stockpile first. This is the best team perk in the game currently, and other options like Battle Focus, these are very strong perks as well. As you go further down the tree, you have other options like Precise Calibration, you know, Concentrated Fire, and some of these stronger perks, but like by the time you get these, you're gonna have a pretty easy time leveling in general, because most of your guns will probably be leveled up. Now, the next class we're going to talk about here is the Assault. Assault does have the hardest time leveling up, in my opinion. The main issue here is that your first row of perks are just not that good. I would say the best option here is, funnily enough, not melee related at all, with the perk Auxiliary Arsenal. Secondary weapons damage increases by 20%. If you leveled up your heavy bolt pistol to max and you take an ammo reserve option on the heavy bolt pistol here like this and build it this way on top of this perk, you will have a lot of damage at your disposal for range. This will make your life a lot easier during the leveling experience until you get access to better perks like Overcharge, Armor Reinforcement, and stuff like Zealous Blow, of course, but until then, you are a little bit held back by your perk selection, so just keep that in mind. And as far as melee weapons are concerned for him, if you don't have a maxed out chainsword already, you could take this one. If you want to level up a weapon for the Tech Marine class, you could start off on your Power Axe. The Power Axe on all variants is a very strong option. Fencing, balance, and block will all serve you very well. And overall, these weapons are some of the most potent in the entire game anyways, and very transferable, so just keep that in mind. It is unfortunate the Assault is set up in a way in its perk tree that a lot of his stronger builds, especially for newer players, don't come until much later in his perk tree, so he does take a bit to level. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, Assault does struggle a bit on his leveling experience. This is one of the reasons a lot of people don't like playing him at first, because until you get perks like Overcharge, Armor Reinforcement, Zealous Blow, Proven Efficiency, and stuff like that, he does feel a lot worse. So just stick with him. When you're playing the Assault, you have to keep in mind that he does get substantially more entertaining and more powerful with levels like all the other classes, but his best perks really are at the end. So don't feel too bad if you're struggling at the very beginning. As far as perk trees are concerned for his weapons, if you're building a fencing option, which I think a lot of newer players will, on the Power Axe, I would just set it up like this because you do get the most benefit out of the overall perk tree for things like Gunstrikes, Power Wave, and stuff like that. And you also get a bit of armor regen, which will help you survive a bit. But you know, leveling up your Power Axe will also take some time. Now, the next class we'll be talking about is Vanguard. Now, Vanguard doesn't have too hard of a time leveling up, mainly because some of his best perks are right in the first row. Things like Zone of Impact and Tactical Prowess to gain AoE execute damage. This is his best combo in the entire game. You get it like right off the bat. And also, once you hit level 13, you will have group heals with Unmatched Heal, so really not too hard as long as you can make it past the initial matches. And also perks like Duelist, perks like Thrill of the Fight, perks like Restless Fortitude. These do make your life easier for new players, especially because it's just free damage reduction. And on top of that, his diving kick ability, this will scale up with difficulty, which means that you will have an easier time punching up with him than some other classes. And now, as far as his weapon selection is concerned, he does have some weapons that will overlap with Sniper and the Tactical. Things like the Instigator Carbine are also found on the Sniper class, Bolt Carbine and Melter Rifle are on Tac, and the Oculus Bolt Carbine are found on the Tech Marine class. So if you want to level this one up to have an easier time on Tech Marine later, you definitely could. All of these are pretty good options. Melter Rifle is probably the most noob friendly option in the game because it just has an instantaneous fire. It will stagger, get you CHP back, and it also has healing perks and armor restore perks like right off the bat with some good ammo economy. So I do think this one would be like the overall best for brand new players. Now, as far as your secondary goes, heavy bolt pistol once again. Once you have this leveled up on one class, you're having an easier time on all classes. And it also goes for Vanguard. And as far as this melee weapon selection is concerned, you could start off with like your combat knife if you really wanted to, but chainsaw and power axe are also present here. If you did level them up on previous classes, you can transfer that over to him. So it's really not too bad. And as far as perks, you should prioritize things like Adrenaline Rush at the very end. You're not going to have access to this healing perk for very long if you're prestiging this class, so I would probably just focus on Unmasked Zeal first, and stuff like Consecutive Execution and Conviction, because these perks will just make your life much easier as a brand new player, because damage reduction for this perk is very strong, and this perk will just give you way more melt-up bombs that will save your game. So really not too bad. Maybe a bit of a learning curve because Zone of Impact and Tactical Prowess are a bit harder to use for newer players because you have to know the actual HP of the enemies and how the lock-on mechanic in Space Marine 2 works to properly use this. But overall, it's really not that awful. So hopefully that'll give you a better idea of how you want to level up your Vanguard. The next class we'll be talking about here is Bulwark. Now, Bulwark has a pretty damn easy time leveling up because number one, you get Conviction right off the bat. And this is one of the strongest damage reduction perks in the entire game, on top of the fact the Bulwark has a 30% increased starting HP, so you are incredibly tanky the moment you start playing this class and level up a single time. So really good option here to get you through your first column up until you gain access to the Intimidating Aura perk. Because once you have this one, a perfect time parry does area effect damage in a 5-meter radius, the cooldown is 5 seconds. You'll have an easier time punching up into higher difficulties because this perk does scale with difficulty. So the higher difficulty you're playing on, the more damage this does. And if you have a maxed out heavy bolt pistol from other classes you've been leveling up, you will be able to one combo parry Gunstrike any Majoris in the game with this perk active on Absolute. So really easy for that. And once you go into perks like Steel Within, you're just going to be super tanky and super damaging, even if your actual weapons suck. So a really good option. And you won't even need things like Invigorating Icon potentially, because as long as you just take a fencing weapon with these two perks here and focus Restoration for armor restore for your entire team, you're probably going to have a fairly easy time, especially if you're not punching up too high into like ridiculous difficulties. So really good options all around. Now, as far as secondaries go, you do have access to the heavy bolt pistol, plasma pistol, and Volkite like the other classes do. But, really just stick with heavy bolt pistol for the most part because the gun strikes on this hit like a truck. The ammo economy is pretty strong, the ammo reserve option. And I assume by the time you're leveling up most of these classes, you will either be leveling up this weapon or will be maxed out already. Now, as far as your melee options are concerned, I would probably stay away from the Thunder Hammer for now because you do want that shield. That shield does make your life way easier because if you do take a Thunder Hammer, you will lose access to your war gear, and your war gear is the shield here, and the shield will block 100% of incoming range fire while you are blocking. So incredibly powerful option and really good for new players. So I do think you should probably keep this for the most part, and I would just level up my power axe, my power sword, or my chainsaw if you haven't done so already. That is up to you. The next class here is the sniper class. Now, sniper only has access to one melee weapon with the combat knife, so if you are trying to prioritize a sniper, I would play knife on Vanguard or TAC if you've not done so already. Having a maxed out knife will make your life way easier on the sniper class in general. Same thing with a heavy bolt pistol and a bolt carbine. This gun is also present on the tactical. Same thing with the stalker bolt rifle and the indicators. You want to level these up first. You definitely can do that. And then going on to sniper will be a lot easier in the long run. Though I will say a lot of players will probably want to level up their bolt sniper or last fusel because you're a sniper. I assume you probably want to play a sniper in the first place if you're going to play a sniper class. So if you want to take these guns and then level them up with your relic tiers on the heavy bolt pistol and combat knife, you can definitely do that. As far as the perk tree for this guy is concerned, I ain't gonna lie to you guys. The sniper's first row is pretty shit for leveling. Like, his leveling experience is not that good. Until you have access to things like squad renewal and renewal for getting back your camo cloak charge on headshot kills, you will be severely limited in your cloaking capabilities. And the best perk in this whole row here is, of course, Purification. Manually activating camo cloak removes negative stats effects and restores all of your contested health. This perk will kind of carry your entire leveling experience. Once you have access to this perk, your entire life will be easier, even if you don't have damage reduction perks in the prestige perk tree like Conviction yet. And overall, it is by far the best perk in the first row. Even though things like evasion, persistence, and the perk here, marksmanship, aren't terrible, you just don't really pop off on this class until you have access to stuff like targeted shot, the perk tactical ambush for melee damage on camo cloak and range damage on camo cloak, and then the squad renewal and renewal perks, because these really are like the two enabling perks. As long as you have one of these, your entire class runs significantly better, but until then, you are a little held back, so just keep that in mind. It might suck for a bit, but it definitely gets easier over time, and that's definitely true for this class and Assault especially. Now this brings us to the Heavy class. The Heavy class is a bit unique in that the majority of his weapons are exclusive to him, but luckily for him, there are a lot of heroic variants already on this guy. He has a heroic Heavy Bolter, he has a heroic Heavy Plasma, so leveling up these guns is far easier than it used to be, because the big problem with weapons like this in Space Marine 2 is pushing up into higher difficulties with a lower tier range weapon just kind of sucks. Like, a lot of their damage breakpoints just are not there until you have relic tier components and stuff like that. So he is definitely feeling a bit limited in that regard. But if you're trying to level up the Heavy in conjunction with other classes, I would say focus on the Heavy Bolt Rifle Heroic variant that's coming out in patch 12, because this one is present on TAC and the Tech Marine, like I mentioned before, so you're gonna be having a bit of a catch-all there. And I assume if you're leveling up your character, you probably don't have like an endless supply of accolades yet. So if you really want to invest in just the Heavy class, you could pick up the Heroic Heavy Bolter and the Heroic Heavy Plasma. These are really good guns. The Heroic Heavy Bolter especially is the best variant of the Heavy Bolter in the entire game, but you will be losing out on some of those accolades points, so just keep that in mind. Now, the Pyre Cannon, like the Pyre Blaster, does have a scaling burn damage with difficulty, so a really good option here, and one of the easiest to level up and punch up into higher difficulties with, because that burn damage will be good no matter what, unlike the Heavy Bolter, Plasma, and Multi-Melta. But just keep that in mind that the heroic variants, they are going to kind of carry your leveling experience of this guy if you're trying to go as fast as possible. Now, secondary options also include Heavy Bolt Pistol, Plasma, Inferno, and Bolt Pistol. We already talked about these a lot already, so these ones are pretty good options as always, and the Heroic Heavy Bolt Pistol and Heavy Bolt Pistol especially are quite strong. Now, for the perk tree, his perk selection is okay off the bat. Restoration is a very strong perk, probably the best perk in this first column, besides things like Encompassing Aegis and stuff like Adamant Will. You do get health damage reduction, you do get range damage reduction, and you do get some damage bonuses here. It's really not too bad. I would say the major perk you want to rush for here is Fortitude, because once you have a health increase of 30% on this class, you are substantially tankier, and if you are prestiging your class for the first time, I would also rush Conviction, because Conviction is a very powerful perk in Space Marine 2, and I believe you can get it right off the bat. Yes, you can. So Conviction is a very strong option, and I would probably pick this up first. It'll make your entire leveling experience far easier, and then I would go for Auxiliary Reload. I'll make a video on Prestige perks at some point here for like an update guide, but for now, on Heavy especially, Conviction and Auxiliary Reload, these are really good options. Just keep that in mind. That's pretty much all there is for the Heavy class. His perk tree is actually, funnily enough, quite limited, because your best options are like right off the bat, and then you're kind of just like picking up some extra stuff like Consecutive Execution, maybe Power Regulator, maybe Overwhelming Power and Brute Force, like up your damage. But as far as like the base function of your class is concerned, it's really not too bad. He's in a pretty unique spot in that his perk tree kind of needs to rework, but overall it's pretty powerful. It's just a bit limited, and that's really all there is for this class. And now this brings us to the final class we'll be talking about today, which is the brand new Tech Marine. Now, Tech Marine's leveling experience is kind of dog shit, because your perk tree is just not set up in a way that any of your best options are around until the very end, very similar to Assault. Things like your equipment recharge are not here until the very end. Things like your burn effect on your servo gun are not until the very, very end, and your best team perk is also at the bottom. But what you do get is your best melee perk at like level 3 or so with Arc Cleave. Damage from charged melee attacks increases by 25%. This perk is really damn good. This is just the overcharge perk, but like immediately in your perk tree, and because of that, weapons like the Omniscient Axe, I assume a lot of people want to use, are quite strong, but the Power Axe especially is an incredibly potent option. The balance version, block version, fencing version, whatever you want to take, they're all pretty strong, but balance, especially in patch 12, this one gets a base damage increase, and you can just straight up one combo Majoris right off the bat with this class if you have a max level power axe, because basically the servo gun lets you gun strike immediately in the middle of your power wave without any animation. It's like a big class ability of the Tech Marine, and you'll be able to one combo a Majoris off of a single overcharge with your arc cleave into your power wave into a parry gun strike on top of your overhead strike. Hopefully that makes sense, but really, as far as the power axe is concerned for this guy, I would just build pure melee damage like this. I assume by the time you actually level up your Tech Marine, your power axe will probably be close to maxed out. It really should be, in my opinion, because I wouldn't level up Tech Marine until much later of all the other options, mainly because he needs some help. He's probably the weakest class in the entire game at the moment, so having some stronger options for him and his weapon selection right off the bat will help your leveling experience with him especially. Now, the heroic heavy bolt rifle is also here that I mentioned earlier, but he also shares things like the bolt rifle, auto bolt rifle, Oculus bolt carbine, and the plasma incinerator. This weapon kind of sucks on him, so I really would stick to like the heavy bolt rifle or Oculus. These are the strongest options on him currently, in my opinion, and leveling this one up on the Vanguard is quite easy, and also leveling up the heavy bolt rifle on your tactical or just buying the heroic version is also quite easy, and they're both quite strong for him, so just keep that in mind. As far as secondary options go for him, he has access to pretty much all of them: bolt pistol, heavy bolt pistol, plasma pistol, inferno pistol, or neo volkite. You can pick your poison on this one. Obviously, heavy bolt pistol is probably one you will have maxed out by the time you level this guy, or level 2 classes or so anyways, so pretty easy solution to just having a good secondary gunstrike option. Though on the Tech Marine in particular, your secondary option does not affect your gunstrike damage at all, because your servo gun has separate gunstrike damage from your secondary unless it is currently in use, in which case it will then use your secondary with the actual animation. So that's like a little bit of a little bit of a technical limitation on the Tech Marine, hilariously enough. But that's pretty much all I have to say about this guy. As far as prestige perks go, just take chained headshots first. This is like the acuity perk on tactical for some more headshot damage. This guy is all about just being able to shoot people in the face, and the biggest thing that's going to carry you in the early game for this guy is really going to be your tarantula sentry guns, because your starting perk here is that you can detect and activate tarantula sentry guns. They will attack nearby enemies until they run out of ammo or are destroyed. These things are quite powerful on all difficulties, so this will carry you in the early game especially. And you will also get buffs around them thanks to the fact that your first team perk is reinforced position that will make you take less damage and deal more damage all within 15 meters of an active tarantula sentry gun. So I would definitely play around these on top of your melee damage and overall AoE capabilities, things like your heavy bolt rifle grenade launcher. But besides that, this guy does kind of struggle in the leveling experience. Your servo gun itself is not very strong at the moment until you have fire perks. Saber Interactive did state they don't intend to have a major perk rework for this guy right off the bat, so I imagine most of his issues, at least in his perk tree, are probably going to be present on launch. So I would probably just try to prioritize stuff like armor restoration, equipment regen if you can, but to be honest, most of his power is going to come from weapons and burn perks later in your tree, which are just not accessible right off the bat. So he does struggle a bit when it comes to leveling, but he's not like, useless in higher difficulties. It's just that his best perks are at the bottom, and some classes are just like that in Space Marine 2. So those were some general suggestions on leveling builds and the overall experience, or how I feel about it for some of these classes in the game. Though I do want to mention before we sign off here that you can level up whatever you want in Space Marine 2. Do not feel railroaded into like one optimal path. There is no like one single perfect way to level up every class in the game. You are just going to be grinding XP in Space Marine 2 because that is just how the game is designed. Some things might make it go a little bit more easily, but if you want to play one class over another and it's not like the perfect class to level up first, it really does not matter, guys. Play the game how you enjoy it. Play whatever you want first, because you're going to be playing for a long time, I assume, either way, if you're invested in Warhammer 40k or a horde shooter like this. But that is pretty much all I have to say in this one, guys. Let me know what class you've been leveling up, or which ones you leveled first, and which leveling experience you think is the best or worst in the comments section below. And if you want to find me live to ask me questions about the game or just come hang out, you can find me here on YouTube or on Twitch with a link in the video description alongside a link to my community Discord. And as always, thank you for watching, take it easy, bye.